Alright, today we're going to be learning how to apply deductive reasoning. Our objectives for today, we will be able to use valid forms of deductive reasoning, including the law of syllogism and the law of detachment. We will also be able to determine the validity of a logical argument. So let's recall from our first notes of this unit that deductive reasoning is the process of forming a logical argument by using facts, definitions, accepted properties, theorems, or postulates in a logical order. The law of detachment uses one fact to make a conclusion. So it would be something like if we were given that P then Q happens, and then they tell us that P is true, we can make a conclusion that therefore Q is true. So let's look at an example. Use deductive reasoning to determine a valid conclusion to the following statements. If it is Friday, then the cafeteria sells pizza. And we know that tomorrow is Friday. We can make the conclusion that therefore, since the hypothesis we were told is true, we can make a conclusion that the cafeteria will sell pizza. Some notes about truth versus validity. A statement can be true or false. An argument consists of statements that are true or false. And then an argument is valid if the conclusion follows logically from the hypothesis. So statements are true or false. Arguments are either valid or invalid. So let's look at another example. Determine whether the argument is valid or invalid. So if I walk in the rain, that's our hypothesis, then I get wet. That's our conclusion. I got wet. Well, that's related to our conclusion. Therefore, I walked in the rain. That brings us back to our hypothesis. One of the ways to tell if an argument is valid, remember, an argument is valid if the conclusion follows the hypothesis. Here, the hypothesis is at the end. It follows the conclusion, not the conclusion following the hypothesis. Therefore, this is invalid. They used the converse. The converse isn't necessarily true. It might be, but it doesn't have to be. I got wet, therefore I walked in the rain. You might have gotten wet by taking a shower. It doesn't have to be because you walked in the rain. Our other law is the law of syllogism, and we're going to look at a video to show you an example.
Too much for cable, you feel powerless. When you feel powerless, you want to take the power back. When you want to take the power back, you take karate. When you take karate, you want to use your karate. When you want to use your karate, you become the fist of goodness. When you become the fist of goodness, you run along rooftops. And when you run along rooftops, you fall into a dinner party. Don't fall into a dinner party. Get rid of cable and upgrade to DirecTV. Call 1-800-DirecTV.
So, when you pay too much for cable, you feel powerless. After one thing leads to another, you may make some decisions that could lead to you ending up falling into a dinner party. This is an example of the law of syllogism, which is also called the transitive property. The law of syllogism uses multiple facts to make a conclusion. If we wanted to look at it symbolically, if we were given that P then Q happens and Q then R happens, we could make the conclusion that P, therefore P then R happen. We sort of cut out the middleman. So, in number 3, let's use deductive reasoning to determine a valid conclusion to the following statements. So, law of syllogism is a type of deductive reasoning. So, if there are no clouds in the sky, then it will rain. If it rains, then I might get wet. We have the same statements at the end of the first and the beginning of the second. So we can cut out the middleman and draw the conclusion that if there are clouds in the sky, then I might get wet. Now, in order to draw this conclusion, Q had to be the conclusion of the first statement and the hypothesis of the second. So let's look at another example. Determine whether the argument is valid or invalid. Explain your reasoning. If I live in Sterling, then I live in Virginia. If I live in Herndon, then I live in Virginia. Therefore, if I live in Sterling, then I live in Herndon. If we turn this into symbolic form, we could have P, then Q. Then, if I live in Herndon, we need a new letter. Let's use R. Then, this was the same conclusion as the first one, so that's still Q. Therefore, P, then R. Q was not the first conclusion, or it was the first conclusion, but it wasn't the hypothesis in the second statement. So we can't use the law of syllogism. This is invalid. Would want the converse of what is written for the second statement. So this is invalid. The converse isn't necessarily true. Now, for your conclusion or your summary, compare and contrast. Use your own words to explain the difference between the law of detachment and the law of syllogism. Write your summary.